Today is Thursday. We have just gotten through the first 2 weeks of patch 11.1 and of season 2, and it's now time to talk again about Mythic Plus. We checked last time like 5 days ago, very into the second week. Now we have gone through the entirety of the week, and let's see what is changing. Now we are still expecting, of course, some balance tuning for the specs and classes, which didn't happen, somewhat surprisingly, at the beginning of this week, at the end of the Race to World First, but very likely will come down either at the beginning of this weekend, so by tomorrow, or before the next reset of this season. But for now, we can see some tendencies in the choices of players for Mythic Plus compositions, and see how things have been progressing. Last time we made a video, we tried to go for the more niche, for the more underplayed or perhaps simply underrated specs. We mentioned specs like Unholy DK, like Demo Warlock, like Sabrog, and like Elemental Shaman. But for today, instead, we are just rather looking at who is being on top in general. And of course, as we have done before, we have to start from the two least surprising of the roles and of the choices when it comes to tanks and when it comes to healers. Because for tanks, it remains Vengeance to be the tank of choice. In fact, from the first week to the second week, Vengeance has gone up even higher than before, almost a 20% increase compared to their week 1 popularity. Of course, if every week the average key level keeps going up, it means that every week you are gonna have a tighter and tighter number of specs allowed in those key levels. Week 2, the average for the top 2000 keys of this second season was 13.5. So between a 13 and a 14 in Mythic Plus, and that's where Vengeance grew in popularity. Now, to be fair, at the moment, Protection Paladin is still holding up decently well in terms of popularity, even if you start looking at the higher keys. 12 and up, at least 1 in 5 groups will have a Prot Paladin, so it's still not that bad for now. It was, after all, the prediction of choice where before the release of this season we were expecting the rise of Vengeance with the loss of Prot Paladin, especially after receiving quite a bunch of nerfs, but even despite the nerfs, considering how good it was before, it would have likely remained a pretty popular tank anyways, which is what we are seeing right now. Vengeance in first and Protection Paladin in second. This is not changing. Now, on a similar note, there has been a similar trend for healers where Discipline is remaining the #1 healer of the season, and just like Vengeance went up, not nearly as much from week 1 to week 2, but still went up in popularity. Now, much like Vengeance being first still has some room for other tanks, namely Protection Paladin, the case is the same for Discipline. Despite Discipline being first, you still have a reasonable room for both Restoration Shaman and Mistweaver Monk, both nearing the 20% representation in 12 and up level keys. So basically in half the keys you will have a Discipline Priest, and then in the other half it will be split between Mistweaver and Resto Shaman. But besides that, it continues to have Discipline Priest as, again, the confirmed prediction before the release of the season as the #1 healer. Now, where things get more varied is in the DPS category. Now, we have continued the trend of some of the popular specs from one week to the next with some notable improvements in terms of popularity. The largest gap, the largest increase of practically a 60% increase in popularity from week 1 to week 2 goes, I'm afraid to say, because it's always bad for the player base, it's bad for humankind whenever you see Fire Mage being meta. Somehow, some way, Blizzard always finds a way to turn this spec into a meta spec, and this season happened as well, not just the raid, but in Mythic Plus as well. The biggest gain one week to the next goes to Fire Mage. This is not one of those asterisk popularity like sometimes we mention, for example, Red Paladin being very popular, but it's really only in that big mid cluster between +10s and +12s, and then as soon as you go up in keys, it starts losing popularity, kind of like that. Not really for Mage. Mage is popular at all key levels, not just the weekly 10s. You know, Fire Mage is already the most popular spec in your weekly 10. If you start going in 12 and up, Fire Mage is still the more popular. If you go to the 14 and up, Fire Mage is continuing to be the more popular. So practically at all key level ranges, it is still a very popular spec. As well as at the moment the highest of keys. Also there you have Fire Mage being the DPS of choice. The other ones that have increased from week 1 to week 2 have been Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid also has slightly increased, no, not a 60% gain like Fire Mage, like a barely, not even a 20% increase from week 1 to week 2. Balanced Druid is also one of the members of the groups at high levels. It's also very popular, just like Fire Mage, at all key levels. Just like Fire Mage, even for your weekly 10, Balanced Druid is the third most popular behind BM Hunter for ranged, and if you add the melee DPS, something we have mentioned every time, it is still more popular than everyone but Red Paladin, who is just more popular than all of the other specs, all of the other DPS specs. But even if you go above +10 and you start getting into, 12 and up, Balanced Druid, just like Fire Mage, is still there, and then 14 and up and the very high keys is practically starts to show somewhat kind of only Balanced Druid and Fire Mage, with the other one being what we mentioned, possibly being an option, a pick, which would have been Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman hasn't actually improved from one week to the next. They have remained more or less the same. In fact, they slightly decreased in popularity as the keys start getting higher in level. Who, however, had gotten the largest gain, which is not nearly as visible or as flashy as the one of Fire, simply because, of course, Fire increased in popularity while also being by far the most popular. The one who has increased the most, actually, which is like a 130% increase in players, is Unholy. Unholy more than doubled its popularity from week 1 to week 2 of this Mythic Plus season. Even if we go and look at the DPS results, Unholy had been in the top of the results ever since week 1, and then week 2 they cemented their position at number 1 in terms of damage. Once you start looking at the very high keys, even right now, if you were to look at, page 1 of Raider.io, the top 40 keys being done, 19 groups out of 40 would have an Unholy Death Knight. So, Unholy, while perhaps now at least not being a very popular spec at all key levels like we just mentioned for other specs like Fire, like Red Paladin, like Balanced Druid, if you look at all key levels, for example, it's not that Unholy is this superstar. It loses to Enhancement, it even loses to Fury Warrior, it even loses to Havoc as well as to Windwalker. That's one of the growing specs, the specs that become better off later on. As you start already looking at your weekly 10, Unholy is still seemingly completely mid, seemingly not a very popular spec. Then you start looking at 12 and up, Unholy now suddenly is the second most popular. Has leapfrogged everyone else, but except, of course, as usual, Red Paladin. And then you go into 14 and up, and suddenly Unholy also passes Red Paladin at 14 and up. And then even, why not, we can go into 15 and up for the total domination of Unholy over the other melee specs. So you have this configuration right now in terms of popularity for the title keys, even though we are far, far away from these ones being title keys. But Unholy would be the one pick for your melees, and then for your ranged it would be Fire and Balance. So it's Unholy, Fire, and Balance. Now, we talked about the possible predicted comp being a Vengeance Demon Hunter focused comp with casters, because Vengeance gives you the magical damage debuff, so it's easy to bring in a Mage, because then the Mage also gives you Intellect, and then you bring in a Priest Healer for PI as well. Why not? Let's slot in, for example, a Druid for versatility buff with Mark of the Wild. Now, Unholy can get partially this benefit, because after all, Unholy, despite being a melee, of course, still does all of its damage as magical, shadow damage. So, Unholy can still benefit from the magical damage debuff of Vengeance. Yes, they cannot benefit from Intellect, of course, of a Mage, but at least partially, part of it, the Vengeance buff for magical damage, and then of course the Balance buff for versatility, they can still take advantage of those. Unlike your other more traditional melee or physical damage dealing specs, which would not gain nearly as much from a magical damage debuff. This seems to be the configuration for now when it comes to the very highest of keys, which is still somewhat different from the general population. If we were to look, for example, at the most popular comps right now, without looking at a particular cut-off of key level, you would still see specs like expectedly you start with the first 4 at this point we can confirm being expected. So Vengeance, discipline, fire, and balance. After those, though, at this overall level, you see, for example, still way more red paladins, and even more elemental and enhancement shaman, splitting their time in the comp. It's only a couple of Unholy DKs being in the most popular runs overall. But of course, as you start going up in key levels, Unholy, as we have just seen, grows significantly in popularity. We also had an entire video about why Unholy is doing this much damage, with what kind of spec, with what kind of build, and with what kind of RNG in this Sun Lane build they are running. Now, DPS, as we have just seen from the popularity, doesn't exactly correlate to being meta at the end of week 2. Even if we were to look at the first few days of week 3, it's not too much changing. You see specs that we haven't mentioned yet, like Assassination, like Outlaw, like Enhancement, like Feral, like Demo, Windwalker, even Elemental Marksmanship. All of these specs seem to be doing great in terms of DPS, but not really in terms of popularity in the groups. Now, a partial applause to Blizzard, because these lines seem to be all quite very even, right? If you exclude some of the couple of dead specs like Frost and Arcane, because there are simply an overwhelming amount of fire mages being played compared to the other two mage specs, there seems to be a very, very thin difference in these results, right? You have, for example, Devastation averaging 2.8 million, with marksmanship or elemental or even balance averaging around 3 million mark, which is less than 10% damage difference from one of the bottom specs to some of the top specs right now in terms of damage. Some of these specs can also change their profile, their damage based on key levels. Of course, Shadow Priest, as you might be wondering, doing terribly. You know, if you were to look at the DPS meters right here from average key levels, it wouldn't be doing too well. Shadow Priest requires packs, pools, enemies to stay alive for a bit longer than other extremely front-loaded specs like Red Paladin, or specs without too much time to get going, too much time to start their damage, even like Outlaw Rogue, which play off much better in uncoordinated and lower level pug keys compared to the much higher key levels being completed right now. Now, we have to go back, unfortunately, to talk about some of the possible conflict of interests happening, because of course some of these specs might be doing well, but at the same time they have to still compete with other specs doing even better than them. For example, Vengeance, however well Havoc might be doing right now, they are kind of doomed in Mythic Plus because Vengeance exists. As we just touched on Shadow, sure, they have some room in Mythic Plus, especially whenever you see a Resto Shaman in the group or a Mistweaver Monk in the group, there might be room in there to run a Shadow Priest. For example, if you look at some of these very high level keys, as soon as a priest goes missing, there is a Shadow Priest. Priest goes missing, Shadow Priest. Priest goes missing, Shadow Priest. Another priest missing, another Shadow Priest. So there is room for that, sometimes. But in the case we just made, for example, of Vengeance and Havoc, it's much harder, because it's much harder to have a Vengeance Demon Hunter missing from your group, and also because it's not that Havoc right now is one of the best specs anyways, even if Vengeance was weak to begin with. Vengeance against Havoc and Discipline against Shadow are the two bigger conflicts right now. There are a few others, but not nearly as relevant, because neither of the specs are as popular. For example, Mistweaver versus Windwalker, or Resto Shaman versus Elemental or Enhancement Shaman. The biggest one for the moments are definitely for the tank and the healer. The poor DPS not really being able to have that much of a choice because of the popularity of the same class that they play in a different role. Finishing, talking about the biggest loss, which is also completely expected because of what we just mentioned, the keys becoming higher week by week, meaning that players become even more picky. More and more as you keep growing in key levels. Week 1 it's all good and nice because you're doing 10 or 11 keys and everyone can do them. Week 2 you start doing 13s and 14s. Now this week players will go more into 14s and 15s, so they will become more and more selective in what they choose. And of course the biggest one to lose popularity is Ret, as expected. As the keys are getting higher, fewer and fewer picks will go the way of Ret this season. They will remain, of course, the most popular overall spec in Mythic Plus, but not really towards the high level of keys. So this is the default we are in right now. Most of this, and we're not bragging right now, but most of this was predicted. You know, Discipline plus Vengeance combo, creating a caster comp with Fire Mage and Balance Druid as the core, with the third possible being Elemental Shaman or Destro Lock, was the prediction. We have gotten close. The third DPS pick seemed to have strayed for a moment, where Unholy at the moment seems to be closer to being one of the choices in the very high up keys. To be fair, at this very moment, in the 15 plus level, it's Balance, Fire, Unholy, and right after Unholy there is Elemental, so it is still quite close to the original prediction. What went completely wrong was definitely Destro, not really played or chosen nearly as much in high key levels, but is what we have for today, which is of course also quite relevant because we are still expecting some kind of balance tuning. Although, to be fair, we also mentioned that the very first balance tuning of the season is much more likely to be raid focused than it is to be Mythic Plus focused. So that's why players were thinking about, for example, nerfs to Windwalker Monk, or even nerfs to Mistweaver Monk. But these are not exactly Mythic Plus meta kind of specs, right? So there is a chance that quite a few of these specs being nerfed won't really be impacting the meta of Mythic Plus. What we are expecting more in the theme of affecting Mythic Plus, you might have nerfs to Fire Mage, definitely, but it would be still hard to dethrone a spot in the key for a mage anyways, regardless of how much fire gets nerfed. It might be more interesting for the third spot, the spot currently being taken by Unholy, which we thought was taken in week 1 by Elemental. That is the more frail one, the one that might be changing more depending on the balance tuning we will get soon. But for today, though, on this Thursday, this is all we have as we get into this third reset of the season. So, with this out of the way, we can now say our goodbyes for now. We can start, of course, as usual, by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, you can always look at the glass half full. If your spec is not meta, at least Augmentation Evoker is dead, and we can all sleep soundly.